Hello everybody and welcome to Rest and Reason. I'm RP the Red Panda and today we are going to be looking at 5 more area control board games, war board games that you should buy from Amazon or consider buying at the very least from Amazon. And this is part of my season 1 area control board game videos. I actually did one already between modern and classic area control board games. If you'd like to see that, click on this link right here and it will send you right over to that video to show you what happened in that last episode and also give you a little bit better of an idea of how this episode is going to work. Now, since you've gotten the basics by watching that video, let's go ahead and get right into our round 1 of this particular video, diplomacy board games versus 4X board games, specifically area control including ones. Now, these two categories, we're going to have our diplomacy be over here. We're going to have our 4X over here. So let's get right into our first diplomacy matchup between diplomacy and Game of Thrones, the board game. Now, Diplomacy and Game of Thrones, the board game are almost identical. Their DNA was copy and pasted. But the big thing that Game of Thrones, the board game did was it took a lot of the clunkiness, a lot of the length of Diplomacy and cut it down to size. And it also made a turn barrier where at the end of a certain number of turns, the game is over and whoever has XYZ fulfilled is going to win. This is better than with Diplomacy where there are only 2 ways that Diplomacy can end. Either A, somebody wins, or B, nobody wins, we all give up and we technically tie, but according to Diplomacy rules, it seems like that is not the same as a victory. Now, in current tournament play, I know that Diplomacy players usually consider it to be a partial victory, but when Diplomacy was created, of course, it was a one-game situation. You would play the game, and if you won, you won, and if you tied, you tied. There was no, this is the points for your tournament. So there was no, oh, this game's going poorly, I'm going to give up and take the tie because that's going to at least give me points. It was, I just spent all day to have us decide we're just going to tie because it's too ridiculous to actually finish this game. Game of Thrones doesn't have that. It has a defined endpoint if somebody doesn't win before then. So it inherently, from just that, gets better. But other streamlining, like the order tiles, as opposed to writing your orders out by hand, are other things that make Game of Thrones just the better of the two. It gets a silver recliner. It's a game I would generally recommend for anybody who wants a long Diplomacy area control game. Whereas I would say that Diplomacy is a game I wouldn't even recommend. For most people, I would say for anybody who wants Diplomacy, just go get Game of Thrones board game. It's better. It's the same thing, but better. Just go get that one. Please don't get Diplomacy. So Diplomacy, I'm actually going to send it right off, and Game of Thrones is going to go up to the next level. Now, next off, we have Daimyo Senso versus Cosmic Encounter. Now, these two are actually pretty different from each other, but they both have a lot of this Diplomacy area control where you need to work together or not work together with people to make the outcomes happen how you need them to happen. Daimyo Senso, without some fixes, is actually another one that I don't recommend people buying. Cosmic Encounter, on the other hand, is a silver recliner. It's a really excellent little game, especially that it's quick and it distills Diplomacy area control down to its pure essential basics. So I'm going to go ahead and move it right up to the next level. Now let's go ahead and check out our 4X round 1 contenders. We've got the game of Eclipse versus Twilight Imperium. Now, there's a lot on the internet about these two games, and a lot of people sometimes get upset that they're even compared, because one of them is more about the economic side of the game, more about the exploration side, more about the science of making your ships, and the other one's more about war and diplomacy. So how can I even compare these two? Well, first of all, they obviously have very similar themes. They're both 4X board games. They both take place in space. And finally, and most importantly to me, they're both something that if you want the feel of a space opera and Odyssey, they both will give you that feel. Maybe not in the same way, but they both will. Twilight Imperium, unfortunately, has to get a bronze recliner. And most of this has to do with the fact that it takes all day to play it. It takes forever to set it up. It's super fiddly in its rules. It's not that this is a bad game. It's that this game is really only gonna be good for very specific people. And then finally, the biggest Achilles heel for Twilight Imperium is the battle system that comes down to just luck. There's no luck mitigation really at all. Almost all the ships are the same from faction to faction. Technologies barely change how the ships work. And in the end, you just roll dice and pray you do better or get hits. And if you don't get hits, your whole game, your whole 12 hours of playing can go down the tubes because some dice didn't roll your way. Eclipse does not have that. First of all, it doesn't really have many battles in it at all because it's more of a Cold War where you're staring across at your other person saying, I'm going to design a ship that's going to make you never want to attack me, or that's going to make me think I can probably attack you, but I need to know I'm perfectly designed to beat you. And then it's going to come down to one battle. That one battle, you had the control over every little piece of your ship and how you made it. You had the control about how big you made your ship group, what types of ships, everything about it. And even the dice are customized so that the statistics are very clear on how likely you are to hit or not to hit. And you can even up the likelihood you'll hit or lower the likelihood your opponent will hit with certain components. And in the end, that one battle that could be crucial doesn't come down all to luck. And you can go back and say, what did I do wrong in the design of this? Not what went wrong on the dice. So Eclipse gets a silver recliner. Twilight Imperium, like I said, already has a bronze recliner. So Eclipse gets up to the next shelf. But Twilight Imperium stays on the shelf. It's not a game I would say you should get rid of. It's not a game I think you shouldn't buy. You just should go into it knowing if you want a super long, super in-depth, super diplomatic, really war-heavy, rolling dice-heavy game, Twilight Imperium is the one for you. But if you want just a space opera feel, go for Eclipse. It's gonna be the better bang for your buck. You're gonna get it on the table more. Our final one is Dwellings of Eldervale versus Scythe. So let's get right into why these two and which one wins. Well, they're both pretty economic heavy 4X board games. They have exploring. Scythe has a little bit less of an exploring element, but it is still exploring when you're walking around with your guy. And so they're both asymmetric. They both have factions. They both have more or less a worker placement part. And so all around, they're very similar games. Scythe, however, shows something that I've noticed lately with Jamey Stegmaier's games. He has some really innovative ideas and some really amazing things that he does, especially thematically. But I have noticed that a lot of times the center of it is really good, but the outside seems undercooked. It seems like a bunch of old clunky designs with single decks and a lot of luck and random things that don't make thematic sense on the outside, because the inside he did so good saying this is this and this is my vision for this game, but the outside he kind of just went, okay, here's the stuff that might kind of work with it. Dwellings of Eldervale isn't this way at all. Every little piece meshes together. Every little thing is important and beautiful. And it's not absolutely perfect game design because there are so many elements in it. Honestly, it's hard to get all of those elements perfect. But it is fabulous game design. It is beautiful. It sings. You have a worker placement, area control, battle game that feels like all three of those without any of them overpowering the others in any particular way. Dwellings of Eldervale gets a gold recliner and Scythe gets a silver recliner. So Dwellings of Eldervale goes right on up to our next shelf. And Scythe, although a silver recliner, unfortunately stays at this level because of some of those small design problems that it had. Now, if you agree or disagree with any of what's happened so far, let me know down in the comments. This is supposed to spark discussion. This is supposed to be a place that if people watch this video, they can go down in the comments and see the debate, see why maybe people think I'm wrong, people think I'm right. Why is that? Let me know, let them know down in the comments. Show your intelligence, show how stupid I am. I don't care. Put it in the comments. So let's go into round 2, which is Game of Thrones, the board game, and Cosmic Encounter over here on the diplomacy shelf. Now, they're both silver recliners, which means it has to go to points. Game of Thrones has a 3.25 out of 5, whereas Cosmic Encounter has a 3.6 out of 5, which means that Cosmic Encounter is our winner going to the next round. But let me go ahead and explain why this is. It's such a close match. Ultimately, it comes down to how often will you get it to the table. This is a ridiculously important point here on this channel. Most channels are going to say, it's a great board game, go buy it. But as somebody who doesn't have a great group for just taking down, especially the really hard, chunky board games like Game of Thrones board game, it sucks having a great game on your shelf that you never take off the shelf. And I know too many people who buy that game and don't buy the other one that they'd like a little bit less because they wanted to play this, but they never will. Don't do it. Save the money, go buy a game like Cosmic Encounter where you're going to get it off the shelf all the time with all sorts of people because it's such a crazy, fun, zany, quick experience of diplomacy. Over here, we've got Dwellings of Eldervale versus Eclipse. Now, this is a pretty epic 4X battle, but in the end, these two economic giants, these two battle giants, comes down, and also giant boxes. They are so big boxes and they are so easy to set up. They both did almost the same thing. In the end though, Dwellings of Eldervale is the gold recliner and Eclipse is the silver recliner. Again, it comes down to the fact that Eclipse is a longer game. It is a more integrated game. But honestly, the biggest thing that's different between the two is that Eclipse is a little bit less generous. It's a game that you have to be very careful how you tweak things and how you do things, or else everything's going to go so wrong it might not even be fun to play anymore. Dwellings of Eldervale, even the worst battle, you can get your guys back in one turn and you're back out there doing your thing. And you just lost, you got a bunch of swords. You now can go beat somebody up for revenge. It's one of those games that takes quicker, but also feels a little bit more generous. And Dwellings of Eldervale heads on up to our final round between Cosmic Encounter and Dwellings of Eldervale. Now, these two great board games unfortunately are not quite as interesting as a finale as last time, where we had gold board games going up against each other. This time, we just have a gold and a silver. It's obvious which one won, but why did it win? That's the more interesting question here. And ultimately, I believe that you should show your support for my channel by clicking that subscribe button, clicking that like button, and letting me know down in the comments what one you think should win or lose this particular contest, and why I am so dang wrong that Cosmic Encounter lost Dwellings of Eldervale. So, Dwellings of Eldervale wins over the simpler, easier to take out, faster Cosmic Encounter, primarily because of tight game design. The game design of Cosmic Encounter is less tight. It's an older board game that shows its age in several of its mechanics. And even though it's a beautiful little game for playing to just have that instantaneous gratification of diplomacy and whipping out crazy cards to do crazy zany things, it doesn't beat the beauty of the symmetry and synergy of Dwellings of Eldervale. And Dwellings of Eldervale is also, at this point, my go-to intermediate game alongside Everdell. Everdell and Dwellings of Eldervale are my two. That's going to be a nightmare in the future, but ultimately, those are the two games that if I'm going from the easy beginner games to the intermediate, I'm going to say to people, one of these two, which one looks more interesting? And they're going to look at those boxes, they're going to look at that art, and they're going to know immediately which one they want, this high fantasy or this beautiful woodland fantasy. Which one do they want? And they can choose it. And I'm going to love whichever one because they're both gorgeous games. So ultimately, Dwellings of Eldervale is our one and only gold recliner and our winner of this week's round. And these are my 5 games to buy on Amazon. And again, I'm going to run down real quick which one you should buy for what reason. So, Dwellings of Eldervale, if you don't own it, buy it. I literally drove a pretty good distance, 65 miles, just to buy this game because I was so excited about how awesome this game is. Okay, Cosmic Encounter, our runner-up, is the game you want if you want fast and very simplified diplomacy area control. It does that amazingly, better than any of the other games here. If you want the long version of that, Game of Thrones board game is the one for you. If you want the space odyssey of 4X, where you're just building the civilization like Stellaris, and you're putting that budget into place and building that ship to blow them up, Eclipse is the one for you. And finally, even though it didn't even make it to the second shelf, Scythe is still a solid game. Still another great Jamey Stegmaier classic, and one that I'm hoping to do a fixed video in the future, so definitely stay tuned for that. But it is a fun game with an amazing little mechanic that is new, that is an innovation that I'm not going to give away, that hopefully you get to try someday. So that's all for me. Please, if you liked this video, please make sure to hit our Patreon. We have videos on there that are exclusive to Patreon. We have things that we want to interact with you with depending on what tier you're in, and we would love to continue making this content for you, and this makes it possible. And as always, thank you so much for joining us today on Rest in Reason.